peril. The fact that the doomsday clock was moved 10 seconds closer to midnight is a mark of our peril, because that clock is managed by world experts who are sound judges of where we stand. And we are at the brink of a disaster. The disaster is because our global politics is failing miserably, first and foremost with the United States, which is a major provocateur of this war and a major threat to the peace, to be blunt. We need a different foreign policy in the United States. Of course, we need a different foreign policy in Russia and Ukraine and of the major powers. And this has to be a foreign policy to get us off this reckless war between Russia and NATO, which is escalating by the day, because the doomsday clock moved 10 seconds closer to midnight at the same time that the United States and Germany agreed to send new, highly advanced tanks to Ukraine in a guaranteed reckless escalation that brings us closer to nuclear war. And the belligerents in this, which start with Russia and the United States, are not even talking right now with each other, which is an absolute disgrace. It's worse than 5-year-old children. The idea that you don't even have a discussion between President Biden and President Putin for more than a year, just public posturing, reckless statements about each other without even a phone call. It's worse than 5-year-olds. And I give a huge amount of responsibility for this horrible situation to the US government over many years. The reason is this conflict goes back actually more than 30 years to 1990, when President Gorbachev, who I had the honor to help support as an economic advisor to his economic team, unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance of the Soviet Union. Unilaterally. And when he did it, he received solemn assurances by Germany and the United States that NATO would not fill the vacuum with US-led military bases and alliances. And the United States lied. Not for the first time, by the way. Because as soon as the military alliance of the Soviet Union was disbanded, the neoconservatives in the United States, that is the military-industrial complex and its supporters, began to plot the eastward movement of NATO. And this started already in 1992. And then in the mid-1990s, after President Clinton had told further lies to President Yeltsin, who I also had the honor to help advise, NATO began its enlargement. First to 3 Central European countries, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, which became Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And from then on, the United States has been pursuing its unipolar agenda of moving American bases, weaponry, missile systems, ABM systems further eastward, with the idea in part of surrounding Russia. And this was laid out by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 in his book, The Global Chessboard, where he talked about the geographical pivots, especially the role of Ukraine as absolutely central stakes in the battle for hegemony between the US and Russia. In 2004, NATO expanded to 7 more countries, including the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2008, George Bush Jr. insisted that NATO would move to Ukraine and to Georgia. And President Putin at the time and in the year before had made absolutely clear that is the ultimate red line for us. And it was in this context also we should recall that the United States had unilaterally abandoned the ABM treaty and started placing missiles in Eastern Europe. And so in 2008, President Putin already told Bush that this was leading to conflict and that Russia would take Crimea if the US persisted in its move. Then please understand that in 2010, 11, 12, 13, Ukraine tried to walk a delicate balancing act between the United States pressures and Russia. President Yanukovych called for neutrality, which is what he understood rightly to be necessary to save Ukraine from the disaster that it's in right now. The United States could not abide by neutrality. And so the United States contributed to the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. We say it's the Maidan Revolution, a spontaneous uprising, but the United States at the most senior levels was involved in that, quote, spontaneous uprising, including the then Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who is now the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and who has been involved in manipulating Ukraine's politics for a decade. She is the inside neocon in the State Department. So this war started, by the way, February 2014, not February 2022. It's a lie that it started February 2022. It started with the overthrow of a government trying to maintain neutrality. And the United States helped put in power extreme nationalists in Ukraine who broke the neutrality policy, demanded NATO membership as soon as possible, and welcomed billions of dollars of arms shipments from the United States starting in 2014. So this war, going into its 9th year, came from a direct collision between 2 nuclear superpowers. How stupid is this? I can't even use polite language because the people in the United States government that have provoked this, these neoconservatives who have been in power for more than 30 years, are putting the entire world in danger. And of course, the media is completely dominated by the US and UK, English language media, I should say. And it tells one story, the bravado US-led narrative. It doesn't tell any of the facts, gives none of the background. And by the way, the United States learned its tricks from Britain, which has certainly been the most violent country in history over the last 2.5 centuries, fighting in almost every place in the world. Now Britain can't manage anything. It can't even keep its clinics open anymore, but it still loves war as long as it's someone else's war. So Britain is the great propagandist of this war. And the English media tell the story Putin invaded, no reason, no provocation, February 2022. It's all Russia's evil, without any background at all. And without the most basic point, which is that this was completely avoidable and preventable if the United States neoconservatives had not been pushing a dangerous agenda for 30 years and putting all of us in peril. It's disgusting. But what's disgusting, by the way, is that they are not even grown up enough to get on a phone call together to say, how do we avoid disaster? This, to me, is inexcusable. Even 5-year-olds talk with each other after they have the fight in the playground. But there's no talk. It's just hate language every day. And we hear the hate language coming from Ukraine's government. We hear the hate language coming from the UK especially. They're the masters of this kind of Russophobia. We hear the hate language in the United States, and we have no negotiations going on right now. And then we hear the Secretary General of NATO as if he's just quoting George Orwell, but he means it seriously. He say, weapons are peace. No, Mr. Stoltenberg, weapons are not peace. Negotiations are peace. Shame on you for saying that weapons are peace. We're grown-ups. Talk like grown-ups. We want to stay alive. We don't want a nuclear war. We don't trust you. Because if you want trust, then talk to the other side. Understand politics. Understand, like Clausewitz knew 2 centuries ago, war is a continuation of politics with other means. It means that politics in the normal sense was not pursued properly, so that politics now is by killing people and destroying Ukraine. Politics is to separate the 2 superpowers, to stop the neoconservative illusion of a unipolar US world. We don't want a hegemon, whether it's the US or any other country. We want a multipolar world. We don't want a world of military alliances that's going to get us into World War III the same way that it got us into World War I, and we've never gotten out of that. Stop these divisions of the world between our side and your side and talk with each other. And especially keep the military powers away from each other. Because the President of the United States should be the first to say NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. We don't want these 2 superpowers accidentally or deliberately entering into complete Armageddon. Think of the United States, how it would be if Russia made military bases in Mexico. We'd say, oh, sure, no problem. That's Mexico's right. Hardly. We'd invade the next day. But the neocons don't have principles. They just have the idea of power. So, well, Russia's not going to do it. We're going to do it. But this is what is bringing us 90 seconds to midnight, for God's sake. So what do we need to do? We need for negotiations to start immediately. I don't know where most of Europe's leaders are. They just have their head completely in the sand, or the US tells them what to do. There are a few that have spoken clearly and publicly, but then the US beats them down. But President Macron has said repeatedly, stop this provocation because we need to respect the security interests of Russia as well as Ukraine. Prime Minister Orban of Hungary has been very clear on this point. But most of the European leaders just follow the US line. And so we don't hear from Europe, and Brussels even more so. It's just a war party. There's no diplomacy anymore. But for the rest of the world, and there are people all over the world listening in, please have your governments call for negotiations immediately. And the negotiations are not between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between the United States and Russia. It's being fought by Ukrainians who are trapped in the middle of this disaster, by leaders who somehow were told by the United States, oh, be with us, we'll keep you safe, just like the US kept the Vietnamese safe, just like the US kept the Afghanis safe. Come on. This is time for honesty and being grown up. Ukraine is not being helped at all by this. Ukraine's being destroyed by this proxy war. But have your governments call for immediate negotiations between the United States and Russia to stop a war that is endangering the entire planet. And it's obvious the first term of an agreement is Russia goes home and the United States stops NATO enlargement. This is the basis of peace, that Ukraine is neutral, and both sides of these nuclear superpowers back off. Neither fills the vacuum of the other. Of course, there are specific issues inside that need now to be settled. We once had the Minsk II agreements, and they were aimed at settling peacefully the conflict in the Donbass. But we even heard from former Chancellor Merkel, oh, we didn't really mean that. We weren't really going to guarantee that. That was bad faith. That was to give Ukraine time to arm. She actually said that a couple of weeks ago. We had agreement for peace, but was it a fake by the US and Ukraine and Germany to rearm? Or was it real? We need something real this time, not something fake. And similarly with Crimea, what Yanukovych was proposing was a long-term lease arrangement for Russia and Ukraine in Crimea, because after all, Russia's had its naval fleet in Sevastopol since 1783. And then every day now, Zelensky says, oh, we're going to chase them out of Crimea. Yeah, over all of our dead bodies. Let's stop this nonsense, this childishness. The whole world's survival is at stake. And this rhetoric is so reckless of these leaders, these so-called leaders, these politicians, who think that with bravado, that they can say anything, but what they're doing is driving us closer to nuclear war. So we need compromises, like the Minsk agreement, like a long-term arrangement for Crimea, and especially for the two nuclear superpowers to back off and stop this reckless NATO enlargement, which was a lie from the beginning, a violation of agreements made to President Gorbachev all the way back in 1990, and hopelessly provocative and dangerous. And that is the key to getting a world back to some protection and some hope for survival. So thank you very much. We need your voices everywhere in every country for governments to stand up clearly at the United Nations and in every other forum to say, stop this war now, stop the escalation, stop the bravado, stop the hate talk, and sit down and negotiate a peace that respects the security interests of all of the parties, and stop the military expansion. This is the root of this war. Thank you very much.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for these highly interesting, but also reminding us to our responsibilities. And I can only say for IPB, with our ceasefire campaign over Christmas, calling for ceasefire, I think we helped to bring the question of negotiation and ceasefires much more higher on the agenda of many organizations which were working for peace, international organizations, trade unions, and others. And we will continue with this. We have in mind to have a big negotiation peace conference in Vienna in May, June, to support your ideas and thoughts. But let me ask you two questions. First question is, what do you think is the role of the European Union, but also of the other European countries? And the second question, who are the forces which can internationally or worldwide, which are the governments worldwide, which can help bringing these war-oriented governments to a negotiation table? Are there international governments? Is this India? Is this China? Are we speaking about Turkey? Maybe you can describe a little bit how we can change the forces in the direction of negotiation and ceasefire.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the second question. Most of the world, and I should be more clear, most of the world's governments clearly want peace and are neutral in this conflict between the US and Russia. It's when this war, the war of 2022, exploded in February last year, the US and Europe said, okay, the whole world's aligned against Russian aggression. Well, actually, it wasn't like that. The vast majority of the world's governments said, stop the fighting. We don't take sides. We don't join your sanctions. We don't view this as a one-sided affair. China, for example, very responsibly said, negotiate, but respect the security interests of all sides. What that meant was the NATO question. And around the world, most governments did not impose sanctions on Russia. They said, we want an end to the war. We are neither Russia haters nor Ukraine haters. We want the two sides to negotiate. So practically speaking, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, the so-called BRICS countries, together with Russia, those countries are major voices for peace and negotiation, and they should continue to say very clearly that their vision is not to side with one side or the other side, but to side with negotiation and peace. And India has a special role to play. Not only is it a great country and a civilization and 1.4 billion people, but it's the presidency of the G20 this year. And so India has plenty of opportunity to push hard for peace and negotiations. Brazil will host the G20 next year. President Lula is very clear that what is needed right now is not military victory on the battlefield. This is a reckless illusion. What is needed is negotiations and an end to the NATO enlargement. And Brazil will be president of the G20 next year. South Africa, which has said the same, will be president of the G20 in 2025. So I believe that these countries have a huge role to play. I think the African Union should make a strong statement that Africa is being endangered by this war. Africa views this war as a tragedy and an unnecessary one, and as a solvable one as well. So the African Union, I believe, should stand up and be clear. This is the time for peace and for negotiations. Turkey, in my mind, gets a special commendation because President Erdogan has worked very hard during the past year, and his very skillful foreign ministry has worked hard to try to mediate between the two sides. It's not easy to do, but of course, Turkey knows the Black Sea area very well indeed, and should be able to play a very important role. But I would say there's not a government in the world that can't contribute to the momentum of demand for negotiations by saying to the big powers, we do not agree with the approach of winning on the battlefield, because that endangers the whole world. Of course, first and foremost, Ukraine, but actually the entire world with nuclear war. And we demand, therefore, a negotiation now. How can they even think to send tanks right now without even mentioning the word negotiations? Shame on them. Shame.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And I have 3 questions from our participants. I will start with a question from my colleague and friend from Ukraine. And he asked, and I will read it shortly to you, the main point. My question is, as economists, can you suggest a way how to deal with structural problems, militarization of all economies and politics, military-industrial complex, which consumed and corrupted our democracies? I will not continue. I think you understand the question. The second question is to the role of the Vatican peace plans. Are there any following up of these important gathering in June? And what is happening with the peace plan now? Are these ideas for a second conference and an end? And the third one is, they were writing a letter to the Mexican government. What do you think about the Mexican peace plan, the ideas of the Mexican foreign ministry, presented to the United Nations in the name of the president of Mexico? So what do you think about the role of Mexico?
Thank you very much. On the first question, this is definitely in part the corruption of our political processes. I can speak about the United States. The US is a government for hire. Our political system is organized around campaign contributions, where lobbyists and major campaign contributors spend billions of dollars, and by doing so, essentially buy the policies of the US government. And I have no doubt that the big campaign contributors have played a role in this war. And because what I can tell you is this is not a war that is popular among the US public, or these neocon ideas are not popular or not demanded by the public, even with all the propaganda we receive from the US government. The public is very skeptical. This is a policy in the US driven by a small group of people that have the hands-on levers of power. And so it is not democracy that has brought us to war. It is the corruption of our political institutions. I couldn't agree more. I think that is why our voices are so important, especially with the mainstream media unwilling, unable, I don't understand it, but absolutely not doing their job of holding government to account, but just the opposite, just becoming megaphones for government propaganda. The New York Times, the Washington Post, useless. All they do is report what senior officials say, even unnamed senior officials, as if these newspapers forgot what their role is in a democracy, which is to doubt the government, to probe, to investigate. They don't even do that anymore. It's pathetic. And so this is a very important reason for this call and for the peace movement to call out this small group that manipulates our governments and that in the end creates threats to all of humanity. On the Vatican plan, we had or not plan, I should say, but the meeting, we had a very good meeting. I can tell you the United States government and government of Ukraine and others were very unhappy in general about any calls for negotiations. This is incredible to me. They have a way of, we've gone a whole year without any negotiations. Shock, and especially we went a whole year without Biden speaking with Putin once. So this is what makes this difficult. The governments, I mean, these governments, these belligerents in the hands of these neocons don't want to talk, and they try to beat down anything we say, and the media beat down the mainstream media beat down the message, though the message is getting through more and more because it's the official narratives are so phony and so much propaganda that more and more channels are finding ways to see the truth. And I think that that's an important development. So I'm trying to think of every way to amplify what we're saying and doing, and I'm open to all suggestions. We need public meetings, we need online meetings, we need leaders that are ready to go against the official narratives, to be speaking out. There have been a number of generals in Germany recently who have said how reckless all of this is and how phony it is and how dangerous it is for Ukraine. And that's very important to hear more of those voices. The government of Mexico, I know, has been pursuing the idea of peace commission and high-level peace. And I think being very practical right now of not only peace in principle or in general, but peace in Ukraine would be very helpful and timely. And if AMLO, the president of Mexico, and President Lula, for example, within the Americas work together, there are many other like-minded leaders in the Americas. And the Americas, the countries of Latin America, could speak out very, very clearly. It would put the US, it would force the US to listen. This is important. The neocons get away with it if they dominate the narrative. But if other governments are saying, no, that is dangerous, that's wrong, then they can't dominate the narrative. And so this is why it's so important for governments like Mexico, which is also a member of the G20, to speak out clearly, and for like-minded countries that are. So everything about mainstream economics at that time was about demand shocks. And the idea that there would be aggregate supply shocks seemed quite unusual, maybe for an individual country, but at a world scale seemed unusual. In the 1970s, the supply shocks were energy supply shocks, not unlike today, but they came from two wars in the Middle East, and from the rise of OPEC, not from the war in Ukraine, for example, and everything that has come afterwards. We also didn't have in the 1970s a pandemic. That's a massive supply shock as well that we're not done with. And we didn't have global scale climate shocks underway either. There was, of course, climate change already happening, but now we're in the year-to-year worldwide environmental shocks reality. It's not a small thing. Europe had mega drought this year. China had a mega drought this year. The United States had a mega drought this year. Many places had huge floods this year. Many places had intense hurricanes this year. This is the yearly norm now, and it's only going to get more extreme because we already have a temperature increase of 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level, and the rate of warming has accelerated. So we're warming at a rate of more than 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we'll be above 1.5 degrees by the 2030s will exceed that target. And maybe even in the next few years, when we go from the La Nina phase that we're in now to an El Nino phase, which will happen soon, that could actually push the Earth's temperature above 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. So we have a massive number of supply shocks. And today, our supply shock started with the pandemic, then the direct effects of the war in Ukraine, then the effects of the sanctions regime, then the effects of somebody, the United States probably, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, then the effects of the climate shocks that are pervasive worldwide. 4 big supply shocks. Probably all of them, even including the pandemic, human-made. So just one word about the pandemic. I chaired a commission for The Lancet for 2.5 years on the pandemic because I have some experience in public health, economics, and previous pandemics of AIDS in particular. And my conclusion at the end of it was that the virus could well have come out of a US-funded, US-China laboratory project that went badly wrong by accident, because the US was funding genetic manipulation of the SARS virus in a way that could really have created this virus. We don't know, because neither the US government nor the Chinese government is saying a word about it. And both are saying, don't look here, go look over at the market. But at the market, there were no animals that were infected that they could find. Almost nothing about the market has any credibility, actually. It's just a place where people sneezed on cages, it looks like, because all the viruses samples that were collected at the market were human samples for sure, and all of them were collected too late December, probably 2 or 3 months after the original event had taken place and spilled into the human population. So I think it's possible that the pandemic itself was human caused. In any event, the outcome of the pandemic was a mess everywhere because no one was very good at stopping the pandemic. The Asian countries were the best because they had more experience with SARS. So Taiwan, from the first moment, said, we don't trust the mainland, we lock down. And they had very few cases. China locked down early on. It's only unlocking now, but it basically had very few deaths. And the rest of the world, including Europe and the United States, South America, or Latin America, Africa, it was a huge disaster, I would say, because our governments were not prepared for this, and because the virus was really transmissible, and probably transmissible because it had 4 amino acids called the furin cleavage site in the protein, in the spike protein of this virus that quite possibly were stuck in there to make it very infectious, because that was the experiment that the scientists wanted to do. Let's see what happens when we add in a furin cleavage site into this virus. That may be what happened. In any event, huge supply shock, which we're not out of yet. Then, and interesting, the reaction of the Fed to the supply shock and the US government. Well, they couldn't agree on anything in the US, including even should we wear these things. This became the most political issue in the United States, face masks. They did pour a tremendous amount of money into so-called macroeconomic stabilization in response to the shock. So the United States ran a budget deficit of general government of 14% of GDP in 2020, which is a lot, by the way. And we spent about $7 trillion, which is a lot even for the US, which is a $23 trillion economy. $7 trillion over 3 packages to respond to the shock, to replace lost wages, to give businesses financial support, to pay the payroll of businesses, to pay rents, and many things. The Fed bought about half of the debt, a massive monetization of the debt, which started in March 2020, the biggest increase of base money in history, anywhere by far, of course. About $3 trillion of base money pushed into the economy from March 2020 onward. That's where a lot of the inflationary impulse was created. The ECB, less in the same direction, but maybe at half the scale of what the Fed did. But the Fed really pumped up the money supply and pumped up the fiscal stimulus. But people couldn't spend any of this money, of course. The whole point was stay home. And so the saving rates soared to the highest rates we ever had, to 25% personal saving rates, for example, until the economy began to be opened up. So the first impulse of the money was to boost stock market prices and Bitcoin prices and tokens prices. We had a huge rise of every asset price possible. And then within a year, the monetary mechanism pushed it into commodities, and within 2 years into the mainstream economy. So this was a supply shock met by an overreaction to the shock, because it was a big overcompensation. And the Fed went overboard not to make sure there was no financial crisis like 2008 by flooding the economy with liquidity. And that's the first roots of what we're experiencing right now. There definitely are monetary roots. But then, of course, came on top of all of this, the war. And just a word about the war. In my view, the war could have been avoided at the end of 2021, and it could have been stopped in March 2022. The issue, to my mind, all along is NATO enlargement as the central issue here. Putin has said since the Bucharest NATO summit of 2008, don't do that. Don't you come up to our borders in Ukraine, much less Georgia. And of course, George Bush, as part of this vision that I learned about the hard way 30 years ago, was pushing the US vision of a unipolar world with NATO everywhere. You know, the first wave of NATO, which was Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland in 1999, was opposed by Russia and contrary to the promise, but not violently opposed, I would say. I think the Russians were very frustrated, but this was Central Europe. This was far from the borders. This wasn't any kind of direct military threat. Maybe it was a cheat on what the promises were, but it wasn't a direct threat. It happened. But under George W. Bush Jr., there were 7 more NATO enlargements, and those were close to home. The 3 Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia. But the real clincher, in my mind, was the 2008 Bucharest summit, where Bush said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. Because if you look at a map, that means surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And it means Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in its basic outlet to not only the Black Sea, but to the Eastern Mediterranean. And to my mind, it was like the first Crimean War, which was exactly the intent of Palmerston and Napoleon III, take Russia out of the Black Sea. And this is the second Crimean War, in my view, in the same way. A kind of, I call it neoconservative madness of the United States, unwilling to hear the concern of the other side at all. So in December 2021, Putin made a last attempt. 3 conditions for put on the table. Crimea remains Russian. The Minsk II agreement is implemented, and NATO not enlarge. And Biden brushed them all aside, said we're not negotiating over any of that. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th of this year. Clearly, the idea of the first phase of the war was to shock the Zelensky government into negotiating. And indeed, in mid-March, the Ukrainians gave the Russians a piece of paper which said, we will agree to neutrality and will agree to put the issues of the Donbass and Crimea down the road. And on that basis, Putin said, draft an agreement, and the Turkish mediators were close to an agreement. And then Ukraine walked out of the negotiations at the end of March. I don't know why, but I suspect because the US told them to. I don't know for sure. But suddenly the Ukrainians said to the Turks, we're not negotiating anymore. We're putting a pause to the negotiations. And Zelensky's new position, which was radically different from March, was we will only negotiate after Russia is kicked out of every square meter of Ukraine, including Crimea. Good luck on that one. And we've been in the war since then. So this is obviously the second huge shock. And the US thought that kicking Russia out of SWIFT and confiscating $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves would crush the Russian economy, and that the world would side with the US on this. And the reality has turned out to be quite different, which is that probably the Russian economy is still functioning okay, I would say, maybe not. I'd love to hear the views here. I think okay. The exports have continued at a somewhat diminished level, but have continued to China and especially India and to the East. And diplomatically, the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore are the team, but the rest of the world says, please don't get us involved. And so it's quite different from a world opposed to Russia. It's really the EU, UK, US, and a few countries in Asia opposed to Russia. And of course, the most enthusiastic country of all, even more than the United States, is the United Kingdom. They just love this because this really is the second Crimean War for them. And they're so excited, so pleased. I think Boris Johnson really thought he was Palmerston and that he was going to be Palmerston or Churchill, but probably Palmerston. And this is the kind of complete mess that we're in. This is quite bad for the European economy, in my view, and Europe, I think, has misunderstood or whatever, has sided with the US approach. in a way that makes no sense from the European economy and that is quite destructive of the European economy. And the most vigorous of this, not the most, gung-ho, which is definitely the Baltic states and Poland, but the key to this is Germany. And Germany is by far the biggest economic loser of this whole operation. And I think the costs are quite long-term and serious for Germany, and unless the war ends quickly. So just to finish that thought, my view continues to be that the war should end through negotiations, and the negotiations should have three parts to them. No NATO enlargement. Crimea remains de facto in Russian hands, and something is done about the Donbass. I don't know what. Maybe it's too late. But rather than reducing it to rubble, it would be better to have even a frozen conflict, if not a full negotiated outcome. I believe that this is possible, and I believe the United States neoconservatives still reject it because they are still after victory, but I don't think victory is coming on the battlefield, and I think the costs for Europe are very, very high, and the costs for the world are quite high. So this is the next supply shock. So what to do about supply shocks? First, the main lesson is central banks cannot fix supply shocks. Sorry to say. Central banks can keep financial systems from imploding. Central banks can be lenders of last resort. Central banks can maintain liquidity. Central banks can maintain monetary stability, but central banks cannot fix supply shocks. Supply shocks are real economy shocks, and they cannot be cured by central banks. So the only way to address supply shocks macroeconomically is through addressing the shocks themselves. You end the pandemic, stop the war, and build resilience to the climate change. It's the only way. It's a lot harder than finding some kind of macroeconomic instrument, but because it is a real economy shock, it can't be solved by an aggregate demand instrument or a financial instrument per se. But that means hard work by governments. And that is what our governments are not so great at in general, especially, I'll say, my own. It's what we really need to do is understand the shocks and face them as the way to proceed. I'll close these meandering remarks with some words about sustainability, about the environmental side of the story, just quickly. In all of this mess, one piece is, of course, the human-induced climate change. It's one of 5 or 10 major challenges, not the only one, but it's big and it's very serious. And I had the honor and great but deeply unpleasant experience of guiding an institute of several hundred climate scientists for 15 years at Columbia University. And it was unpleasant because they're wonderful people who scare the daylights out of you, because they quietly come up to you and say, the world is over. And they do it in a very convincing way with statistics and computer simulation models and brilliant science that you can't argue with. And my most terrifying colleague is a wonderful gentleman, James Hansen, who was the chief scientist, climate scientist of NASA for 30 years and is a professor at Columbia. He's absolutely brilliant. And not a month went by in 15 years where he didn't say to me, Jeff, it's worse than we thought. In other words, it's accelerating faster, the ice sheets are being destroyed faster, the thermal hailing circulation is slowing faster, the aerosol masking of climate change is diminishing faster. He's really afraid. And my advice to you is if James Hansen's afraid of it, you should be afraid of it too. This is very real and it's extremely serious. And one of the issues of the human of our environment is that it's a highly nonlinear system. And so the idea of tipping points is a real thing. We have phase changes in nature. You go a little bit warmer, you go from ice to liquid. You go a little bit warmer, the West Antarctic ice sheet disintegrates, as an example, or the permafrost melts, or the ocean circulation stops or slows decisively. All of these things are happening right now. All these tipping points are in process. We don't know exactly what the thresholds, and when I say we, I mean James Hansen doesn't, because I don't know anything that he doesn't know. But he says they're close. So on that score, there are two major things to do. One is to mitigate the human forcings, and that means dramatically reducing the greenhouse emissions. And the second is adaptation, which means living with the warming that's going to go on for the next century or more. Because even if we stop all emissions now, the warming continues for decades to come, because the Earth has not yet reached thermal equilibrium with the emissions that we've already done, because it takes decades for the oceans to warm. And so the oceans are still absorbing huge amounts of net energy flux coming from the greenhouse emissions we already have. And as the oceans warm, the overall Earth system warms, and that process is going to go on for another century, no matter what the emissions we have. So this is quite serious. And on the mitigation side, of course, the center of the mitigation is a zero carbon energy system and ending the net emissions from nature, from deforestation, and from the farm system. So that's a lot to talk about, and I won't say too much about it, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about it, but we do need to decarbonize the energy system. In this regard, Hungary is relatively better placed than a lot of other countries because you are already substantially zero, not 50% and rising, zero carbon electricity, which is the key. And building more of the nuclear power, to my mind, is the right choice, as long as you take care that it's safe. But it is a right choice. Of course, it should be augmented with other renewables, and what Prime Minister Orban has been saying, that it needs to be part of a multi-country transmission system, is really important, because there is no way for any single country to have a zero carbon resilient energy system. It must be part of a network that is broader and that has more points of distribution of these intermittent energy sources. You'll have base energy, but others on wind and solar and so forth need a distributed system. This, to my mind, is another reason why the destruction of Nord Stream was so awful, because we need cross-border trade in energy. Of course, the gas would have had to diminish over time and probably be replaced by hydrogen in the pipeline. And that's probably what would have happened over time. But the idea, the US new idea, is that trade, they call it dependency. Europe shouldn't be dependent on Russia. This is stupid, actually. Europe shouldn't, it's mainly saying Europe shouldn't trade with Russia. Of course, there should be mutual dependency. It's called international trade. But now we're in a mood of we need self-sufficiency. We need everything at home. You cannot have green systems in autarkic environment. We need transmission across national boundaries, even for gas. And the idea that this was some fatal mistake of Germany to enter into dependency on Russia is just a ridiculous American idea, by the way. Not an American idea, American strategists' idea, because they're viewing the world not in terms of sustainability or economic well-being, but in terms of who's up and who's down, a zero-sum vision of the world, not a actual economic vision of the world. Because in economics, we don't have the concept of dependency on imports. We have the concept of trade, which is mutually beneficial. So we are going to need a grid. And I hope that Hungary really promotes a broad grid. It should, by the way, in the end, once this war is over, sooner rather than later, include Russia again. It should build out wind in the Black Sea region, which is absolutely plentiful and a massive investment. It should actually integrate also with North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, which have huge amounts of sunshine. So that is not the central bank's main function, except to say to the government, that's your function. And that's what really needs to be done. You can help to facilitate a financial system which supports these transformations, which measures the risks of not doing this,